Welcome to the Matt Lancor Podcast, where we dive deep into the stories and experiences of athletes and entrepreneurs who have embarked on their own hero's journey. Whether it's overcoming adversity, pushing through challenges, or achieving success, these individuals have all faced unique obstacles on their path to greatness. In each episode, we'll hear from a different guest as they share their personal journey and the lessons they've learned along the way. So sit back, relax, and get ready to be inspired as we explore the hero's journey of some of the most remarkable individuals in sports and business.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Matt Lancor Podcast. Today we've got an amazing guest who's not just a biochemistry guru, but she's a former Miss Massachusetts, a scuba diver, skier, and a classical piano pro. So whether you're a mom, an active human, or an elite athlete, there's something for everyone in today's episode. Thanks for joining the show, Dr. Erika Ebbel Angle, CEO of Ixcela, the internal fitness company. Catch Erika's TEDx talks on gut health and dealing with the changes our bodies go through during stress. Stay tuned for a conversation that's not just about science, but life, passion, and making a difference. Let's dive in with Dr. Erika.
Well, Erika, thanks for joining the Kombucha podcast. We usually keep it pretty casual, but we're here to talk about the intersection of athletes, entrepreneurs, microbes, and in the context of kind of your hero's journey, if you're familiar at all with the work of Joseph Campbell and his work on the archetype of the hero's journey that we go through as human beings.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And these are all topics that are incredibly near and dear to my heart, every waking moment of my life.
That's beautiful. So we're going to jump right into it
Sure.
for now. I'd love for you to help describe your journey a little bit for some of our followers. So can you describe a young Erika to me? Help our listeners get an understanding of kind of where you came from. I don't know, set the scene. Did you have any favorite interests as a kid? Was it sports? Was it science? What was that kind of early memories kind of look and feel like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I grew up in the California Bay Area. My parents, both of whom, thankfully, knock on wood, are still alive, but they were immigrants. So they came to the States with nothing really. They tell the story of, we came with our two sets of shoes and that was about it. And they, got educated, had to learn English, and ultimately built a reasonable life for themselves, here. And my mom, they're both retired. My mom was a nurse. My dad was an attorney. And, I think what was really important growing up was they always instilled the importance of giving back. So, just remind yourself always how lucky you are and try in any way that you can to give back to the community. So I started volunteering at a very young age. So it was middle school. I was 12, 13 years old at a local community center doing homework help, teaching kids piano. So I play the piano. It's one of my personal hobbies and passions. So teaching them how to play the piano. And at the same time, was always fascinated about science. And there's a whole long story of how I got interested in science. It started with Michael Crichton's book, Jurassic Park, which came out when I was about that same age, 12, 13 years old. Started working on an independent science fair project when I was about that same age. Ended up reaching out to local labs when I was, 11 years old, looking for someone who would take a child in to do science. And of course, it was not easy to find anyone who was going to spend the time on me to, this is an 11-year-old kid, right? Why should we do this? But I did ultimately find a mentor who allowed me to come and do real science work in the lab. And that ultimately really spurred my interest in wanting to become a scientist. And I ended up spending a lot of time on that same science project, as it turned out, from age 11 all the way through graduating from high school, and ended up doing a lot of the big science fairs. And as I grew older and I got more knowledgeable and intrigued with science, that the project grew in complexity. I started working at local biotech companies at Stanford University, and I was kind of a little pushy kid. So I'd be like, oh, I need help with this. And I'd go out and I'd find someone who would be willing to, to help me. And so, love of science started at a very, very young age, love of education, community service, giving back. So there was always sort of science, and then being mission driven, mission oriented to do something that would be useful, to the world. And then ended up going to MIT because all the children who were older than me in the science fairs, a lot of them ended up at MIT because we were all super geeks. So ended up at MIT, did my undergrad work there, continued, got my PhD, and then ultimately, started Ixcela with the goal, again, it's science-based, but to improve population-based healthcare. How can you give people more information about themselves so that they can live better and better qualities of life and have better qualities of life? So, it's funny, we think about our experiences as children. They're very, very important to guiding, who we are and what we become later on.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. Thanks for giving us that kind of synopsis.
Sure.
Now I want to bring you back just a little bit to that kind of early days too. Can you recall like a moment? It sounded like Jurassic Park was one of the books that kind of set it off. But is that one of the earliest memories that you feel kind of you started exploring that inner world, or you started exploring that world of adventure? Or walk me through that transition of what it was like to be a normal kid and then to be calling labs at 10 or 11 years old, because a lot of people I don't think are going to be able to relate to that. So I want to walk them through how those transformations sometimes take place. And sometimes
Sure.
it's mundane, but sometimes it's a book, or sometimes it's a teacher, or somebody prompted a question or something.
Absolutely. So, again, the stories get long. So I just wanted to make sure I didn't keep talking and talking. But when I was 11, my family, we actually went on a trip. So my parents couldn't afford. So there are two choices, right? So my parents said, okay, it's spring break. We have two choices. You can either go on this class trip with your fellow students to Washington, D.C., or we can go to Mexico, to Cancun for spring break. So I said, well, gee, that's kind of a no-brainer, but let's go. We're going to go to Mexico. So we ended up going to Mexico, and one of the places that we visited was a crocodile farm, and they had all sorts of critters, and crocodiles are really interesting. So when they're injured or mortally wounded, what they'll actually do is they'll flip over. So they'll turn onto their backs and they'll slip into a coma and basically like commit suicide. And yeah, it's crazy. So if you ever happen to be wrestling a crocodile, if you flip it over and you leave it like that long enough, it will die. They become limp, and that's it. And if you leave them like that, they won't survive. It's fascinating. And so at that time, I had just watched and read, more importantly, Jurassic Park, and I was reading all these books like Richard Preston's Hot Zone. He had another one called Cobra Event, just all these sort of books on biological, whether it's microorganisms and, just the microbial world. And I was fascinated by this. And then sort of coupled that with this trip to the crocodile farm, came back, and then they said to us at school, okay, it's time to do a science fair project. You need an idea. So I was like, okay, well, I don't know, like, what if I was to look at, do cells, right? Like cells in the body. Because I was reading all these books about, immunology and cells, and do cells commit suicide when they're infected by viruses, right? So like if a cell wanted to.
That's so funny that you were thinking like this as a kid.
Isn't it weird? It's like out of the blue. So this was the topic. And of course I was like, I want to do this experiment to see if cells commit suicide. And it was like, are you okay? I think people wondered if my parents were like, they were asked lots of questions about my sanity. And I said, no, like, think about it. Like, this happens in crocodiles. Like, could it happen in people? And then it turns out that, there's something called apoptosis or apoptosis, depending on how you pronounce it, but it's programmed cell death. So somebody won a Nobel Prize, like, actually proving that programmed cell death actually happens in the body. But of course, at that time, nobody, I was just nuts.
Oh, so this was after the Nobel Prize was after you had this idea.
Yeah. Isn't that crazy? So, that's how I ended up calling up these different labs and saying, I'm a 11-year-old student. I would really like to test this hypothesis of mine. And so they were like, okay, probably not. Who is this child? And maybe we should call her parents just to make sure that, that she's okay. But one lab director did call me back and said, sure, you know what? Come on in. So, I came on in and he said, look, I'm here every day after 4:30 for about an hour. I'm happy to help you. He gave me like the stack of textbooks. So it's so funny that you think about, right, like the molecular biology of the gene, the molecular biology of the cell. So like I read like the first 4 pages and then I was just like, I have no idea. Right. So, but he spent lots of time with me going through all of this day after day. I was there every day. So my parents would pick me up from school and they'd take me to the lab and I'd sit with Michael, my mentor, and he would go over all of this with me. And I ended up, he taught me how to do, basic lab kind of work with some of their non-lethal viruses. And I was able to design experiments and run them. And, that's funny because that's how, again, I was treated like an adult. I took it very seriously. And he spent a lot of time with me. It made a huge difference.
Oh yeah. No, it sounds like you manifested this like person, this mentor, sort of like a supernatural aid or something, like you were looking for it and you ended up finding it.
I did.
So it sounds like your first call to adventure is one of the things they talk about in the hero's journey, is venturing from the known world into the unknown. And it sounds like for you, it was the cellular world. It was kind of this microbial, unseen, untalked about world. And for whatever reason, as a child, you were fascinated with this. Okay, so you find your mentor, you're working in the lab, you're doing hard science, basically from 12 years old all the way. Did you continue doing this through middle school, high school, all the way into?
I did. The science fair project shifted a little after the first year. I ended up, so the virus that I was working on in the first year was the virus that causes cold sores. It's called herpes simplex type 1. I ended up in years 2 through, like 6 or 7, looking at whether there were certain medicinal plants and Chinese medicinal plants that were able to inhibit the growth of the herpes simplex virus. And so doing a lot of just, chemistry, what plants, what in the plants was responsible for having that antiviral activity. And each year the project got a little bit more detailed. It got a little bit more scientific, right? Because my knowledge grew as well as I got a little older and more analytical. So then you're saying, well, I need a special device, right, to do this study. So you would call a local biotech company and say, hey, can I come and do this? Do you have someone who could help me? And I was always inevitably able to find someone who became, a friend and mentor and taught me how to do it. So, I joke now, I'm still doing mass spectrometry. My PhD was in mass spectrometry, but I did a lot of mass spectrometry in high school at Perkin-Elmer, then Perkin-Elmer Applied Biosystems, because they were partnered together. But, you had to, nobody handed you this stuff. You had to go and find people, right, who were willing to help you. But there were people who were willing, which I always, I'm always, it's wonderful, right, that we can find people who are willing to spend the time and be mentors. You have to search and you have to call. And I remember I was looking for a chemistry professor to help me. And I went to Stanford, which was the local university closest to where we lived. And I just said, I need some help. I walked in on a summer's day to the head of the chemistry department's office. He was, I think he was not expecting this. He was in his shorts and, and he was like, who are you? And I said, well, I'm a 15-year-old looking for a chemistry mentor. And he just looked at me like, okay. He gave me some ideas and made some introductions, and I ended up working with one of the professors for several years there as well. So I'd go into Stanford and do some of the chemistry work, and then I'd go to one of the biotech company and do some of the analytical work there. So yeah, I mean, it's so funny you asking these questions. I haven't talked about this in such a long time, but it was really important to building confidence, right? Because I knew I could walk in, and I took all my stuff. You should have seen, I mean, it's just so funny, these huge backpacks of folders and books, and you look for people who can help you.
Yeah, no, that's so powerful. And honestly, this is the stuff that's interesting to me, is what's under the hood. Like, how did you get here? Because it's so easy to look at you and see, oh my God, look at Erika on TED Talks, and she's got her PhD and she's got this company and it's been growing but I know there was all this work under the hood. There was all this trials and tribulations and struggles and different, ups and downs that were a part of that whole journey. And I think, to me, that's what I find most interesting, is what did you learn from an early age? Or, there's two things I want to go back to that you talked about. And one is, can you explain mass spectrometry to my followers, like they're 5 years old? I'm a little bit privy to it because of my materials engineering background, but I think a lot of people would get some value out of learning what it is and maybe what that process is. And then after that, we'll jump into, it's something that you were very good at from an early age, was figuring out what you wanted and then going and getting it. And maybe some actionable advice for people who are looking for a mentor and don't know where to start, or maybe they're not sure what they want to do. And is that a part of the reason maybe why they're not finding it? Or, so those two things, mass spectrometry, and then some of your thoughts on people who are either looking for a mentor or trying to figure out what it is that they want to be, mentored in.
Yeah. So mass spectrometry. So it's a device. It's a machine. I was going to say analytical platform, but let's just say it's a device that is used for, it's used for a variety of different purposes in chemistry. But in general, let's say you have a blood sample, and that blood sample has lots of different types of things in it. And you're interested in learning about what is in the blood sample. And again, this doesn't just apply to blood. You can use this for anything. You can use it for urine. You can use it for different, basically mass spectrometry can be used to look for very small things in any kind of substance, whether it's a liquid or solid or whatever. So you would inject a little bit of that blood or urine or whatever into the mass spec, and it would, again, depending on how you've designed the method. So the output is going to be different depending on what you're looking for. But let's say you want to know what types of things are in the blood. So it will tell you. Now, it's not going to say like red blood cell or serotonin or tryptophan, or it will give you, as the name suggests, and to keep it simple, I'm just going to say it's not just the mass, like mass to charge ratio, but let's assume it's going to give you the size of the different particles that you find in that sample. So, and then what's kind of cool, it's a little bit like being a puzzle investigator. So it gives you these numbers, which are the molecular weights of, or masses of, the masses of those molecules. And you can, what the mass is. So you can do some, chemical calculations, and you can figure out what the molecules are inside the sample that you're testing. So if you go and get your blood work done, you'll see, it'll give you a concentration of vitamin B12. Okay. And then usually at the bottom, it'll say, done. This test was run on a mass spectrometer at Cleveland Clinic. So what were they looking for? So they knew that vitamin B12 that had a molecular weight of, I'm making this up, but let's say 218. So they were able to find it, right, after they injected the sample onto the mass spec, and they were able to figure out the concentration of that specific vitamin B12, and they printed that out, and that's what they handed to you when you went to see your doctor. So it's a device that's used for learning about really small things, how much of them there are in different types of, of fluids, samples, et cetera. And it's used for other things too, but that's kind of its primary function. Is that helpful?
It is. It's actually bringing me back to some of my lab days in the university. I was doing some metals engineering, like characteristic stuff, and we would take like powdered samples.
Yeah.
We'd put them in the mass spec. My understanding is we're basically bombarding it with light particles or something like that, and they would bounce back. And the way that those light particles are bouncing back off the metals, we would get a graph reading, and it would say, okay, in this one, there's iron and magnesium, and it would kind of tell us what elements on the periodic table were present in those samples. So more of my background was in like thinking of the actual elements that were available, but from a biological standpoint, it makes a lot of sense too, that you would want to test what's in the blood, and you would want to test,
that might have been a spectrophotometer. That might have been a different, because I've never used it for that purpose, but that might have been a spectrophotometer if you're looking at the light and the bounce back. So this is different. So what happens here is the molecules are ionized. So there's, energy that's put in this, there's a spray that's ionized. So it's a slightly different, technology, but all of these things are so amazing. They help us to, and they're all very specific to a certain, for a certain purpose. But for chemists and for biochemists, and anything physiological these days, mass spec is sort of the platform of choice to do most of your analysis on.
Yeah, no, I will lean to your expertise in this realm. I was just I ran a couple labs here and there. I'm sure you're right. I'm calling it the wrong name or something. But I think for all intents and purposes, it's kind of the standard that chemists are going to use to measure some kind of solution or some kind of sample and get an idea of what's in there, what's going on. Okay. Now to my second point, what are some of why do you think at such an early age you had this confidence or this ability to go find a mentor? And maybe for people who are working up some of that courage or trying to figure out who they want their mentor to be, or what it even takes to find one, what would be some of your advice for people in that camp?
It's so funny. I've thought about that. Why do I do these things? I guess I never assume the answer is going to be no. So I think part of it is we have a tendency to overthink things. We have a tendency to then self-doubt. Are we asking the right question? Are people going to think badly of us? Are we going to somehow embarrass ourselves? Are we? And I just kind of was like, look, I need help. And I'm not an expert. I need to learn. Right. And so and even to this day, I tell the team all the time, I'm not going to get it right all the time. I don't know everything. I know sometimes it seems like I make decisions like this is what we're going to do, but it's not like none of us really know for sure, right? Whether that's the right thing. And you do the best you can do, but you go and you talk to smart people and you ask them questions, you learn as much as you can, and then you make some kind of informed choice. So for people who are working up the courage, if you need something, just ask, because at the end of the day, what's the worst thing that could happen? The person says no. Okay. So they say no. So you call the next person. And eventually, this is like raising money, and Matt, you know all about this, I'm sure. Like, you raise money. How many people are you going to talk to before they say yes? Probably like 150.
In say Canada, over 100, and you only need one or two yeses.
Correct. You only need one or two yeses, but the answer is going to be somewhere between 100 and 150 no's. And it can be really demoralizing, but I think you walk into it knowing that, and each time you do it, you're going to get better and you're going to learn, and you don't take it personally. And, maybe you get to the 20th one, you're like, man, what am I doing wrong? But it may not even be about you. So I think it's, don't assume your own self-worth from the reactions of others, right? So if there's something you need and you're determined to get it done, you're going to keep doing it until you get it done. And it may take 2 tries and it may take 200 tries. And I think to this day, that's the only way I've gotten anything to work. Because if I stopped at 2 tries, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. Most things taking me 5-10 tries. Some things I'm still trying still to this day. But I think you just got to keep going.
Yeah. Okay. So I love this. This is like just persistence, just a lesson in persistence. And I think also what's important though, is you have to figure out what it is you actually want in order to engage in persistence. You have to know with a strong sense that this is something worth accomplishing.
Well, they call it, don't they say it's like began with the end in mind? And you can't always know that. So people might say, well, how am I supposed to know? Well, you don't always know, but you can have a general sense. And then, I mean, if the plan changes, the plan changes, and that's okay. But, I think you have to start somewhere, and the plan will inevitably change as time goes on and you grow up and you have new experiences, you're in different part of time of your life. Like, these things will change. And that's okay. But, as of today, this is what I need. This is the plan. This is what I'm aiming for. Write it down, and then, go out there. And, nowadays with the internet, it's so easy to find people, to search for them, to contact them with LinkedIn or email or phone, or it's, social media. And
it's almost too easy. I feel like a lot of people in the younger generation, I feel like I'm kind of in the middle. I'm kind of bridging the gap. Like, we didn't have the internet until maybe I was in middle school. So I was kind of like a hybrid where I had some of it growing up, but I didn't grow up with it. Mm-hmm. But I know a lot of the younger generation is stuck in overwhelm because there is everything. You can go on YouTube and learn somebody's life's work in an hour-long lecture that you can listen while you're sitting on the train or in a car commute. And the thought that all that stuff is available at your fingertips is almost, paralysis by analysis. You have too many things going on for you to actually focus and drive that persistence to go towards something. Mm-hmm. So, kudos to you for being able to do that and continuing to move forward, and now sharing some of that wisdom with people who may be looking for some of that. One of the other parts of the hero's journey that I find super interesting is a part that they call the abyss, or the death and rebirth of the ego, in a sense. Did you experience any of this in your scientific career, or did this come up more when you were making your transition from scientist into entrepreneur?
Can you explain what does it mean? What do you mean by that?
So when I'll speak from my example, when I answered the call to adventure, I was an engineer working in food and beverage, pharmaceutical, automotive. I was working in a lot of different manufacturing plants, and I had this call to adventure to take my skill sets in manufacturing and create a clean and functional sports drink. Mm-hmm. I was sick of drinking caffeine goos and caffeine tablets, and some of the ingredients in them, I had trouble, I don't know, like validating that. Their propylene glycol was one of them that was used a lot. It's the main ingredient in antifreeze, if some people aren't aware of that. So I had this calling. And during that time, there's the threshold that you go through where you enter from the known world. I'm Matt. I got a 9-to-5 company car, things are great. And now I'm entering into the unknown world. And typically in that transition, you find a helper or you find a mentor, you start to go through some challenges, maybe some temptations. And then there's a moment where you question everything and you go through this kind of rebirth. You start to gain some of that self-confidence. You start to learn that, hey, my persistence can pay off, but I need to get over this obstacle, or I need to get over this whatever event it is. And for a lot of people, it's different. It can actually be a rock bottom in their life, or it can be a sort of ego death, in the sense that you learn about yourself. You learn that you're not as fragile as you thought you were, and you gain this strength from this inner journey.
Mm-hmm. There's so many stories like that on different, on different planes. There's sort of the career piece alone, right? What was I trained to do? And then what am I ultimately doing now? So I can talk about that. There's becoming a manager, right? As a leader, as a CEO, what is the job? And what do I do most of the time? And it's really hard. And a lot of times it's thankless. And just wrapping your head around that, because there are a lot of days where you're like, did I do the right thing? What does everybody think? And so there's all that. So I think there's a couple of different planes. I mean, I was trained as a scientist. My degree is in chemistry. My PhD is in biochemistry. So I'm a bench scientist by training, who became an entrepreneur who doesn't do any bench science, right? So I spent 27 years of my life at school. And when you become an entrepreneur, and especially if you're sitting in the founder or co-founder or CEO seat, it's really helpful for me to understand the science and technology. I think that it's key in a science startup. The CEO needs to understand, what's going on. But nobody taught me about, fundraising and finance and management and leadership and let alone filling out the forms for raising money and what is this and what's due diligence. And I mean, there was just so much new that at the beginning you just are like, man, why did I do this to myself? Like, it's just hard. And I'm not good at it, and as the years have gone by, I would tell you that through practice, through learning, through listening, through, mentors. I'm also very lucky. My husband are a very seasoned one, lots of experience. So I kind of have a bit of an unfair advantage in that I have someone in the house that I can talk to, learn from, who calls me out on my nonsense and often asks the very pertinent question, what do you want to have happen? And that has changed my life, right? Because, you could decide you want to go and, run down the street screaming and yelling at everyone. And what do you want to have happen? Okay, then, deal with the ramifications of that choice. Or, you choose a different approach to solving your problems. But I would tell you, but it doesn't just stop. It keeps going. I mean, we've tried a lot of things. Some things have been more successful than others. We've changed our business model a number of times. COVID came, changed everything again. I mean, things are not permanent in that they change and you have to change with them. And for those of us I'm kind of a change averse person. I like structure. I like habit. I've always been a rule follower. You tell me, go do this, I'll go do it. This job pushes that every day of my life because, tomorrow, oh, look, this has happened. Oh boy. Okay. We have to change, everything. Lovely. And before that used to really stress me out, and people will come and go, they join, they quit, they leave, or you find out, oh no, this person's not a good match. Now I have to go deal with that. Or there's some crisis, two people fighting about, everything from whose lunch was in the fridge to like some other, disagreement. And there's a lot. And that's the job. I didn't go to school for that. Nobody trained me at MIT for how to okay, let's talk about this. Let's figure it out. Let's have a conversation. And honestly, I mean, I think that's the toughest part. And you go through these phases where you're like, okay, I figured it out. And then, the next day something happens. You're like, nope, didn't figure that out. But it's so much of it is just learning how to kind of go with the flow. And I openly and readily admit to my mistakes because there's just no point. And it's like, sorry, everyone, I screwed that up. No problem. Like and we move on. And then each time just trying to be a little bit better and learning and growing. And, but isn't that a perpetual cycle of being an entrepreneur?
It is. And I think what's so cool about Joseph Campbell's work is he describes the hero's journey in that you can have multiple cycles of it.
Yes.
There can be, you can in the same lifetime achieve several cycles on it. And as entrepreneurs, I think we go through different stages also, when you're going from just an idea in your head to something that's then physically tangible that other people can see, that then people get it and you want to scale it. You go through all these different cycles of growth and change. And with each of those cycles come their own mentors and challenges and temptations and lessons that we learn from those cycles. But it sounds like for you that grit and that persistence translated during that transition. You were able to take that same mentality that you had of this is what I want, this is what I'm moving towards, and take that from the scientific realm and translate it into the entrepreneur realm. And it seems like it's working out for you pretty well.
We're still figuring it out. I mean, I would tell you that's an ever ongoing journey. But we're closer, than we were before. But it could always be better. There could always be more clients and customers. There could always be, more benefit, right, from the product. We could always do more for the people that we work with and that we serve. So, it's ongoing. I mean, it's an ongoing challenge, but that's what makes it fun. That's what makes the journey, I think, interesting. And I always sort of laugh, people will say, well, how long should I stay at a company and before it's time for me to move on and doing something? And I say, well, that's a very difficult question to answer. Doesn't that depend on the company? And right, because if the company never changes, then I can see it getting old really fast. But to your point, in the life cycle of all companies, right, they start here and they end somewhere else. We're not the same as what we were a year or two ago, or even, 10 years. I mean, no, we haven't been around for 10 years, but let's say at the beginning, 7-8 years ago when we started, we were very different. And everything has changed along the way and the systems have changed. And so, I've definitely grown, and many of the people who've stayed with us for many years have grown because the company has changed. The needs have changed. The requirements have changed. And so they've grown immensely from then, till now. And then in our next cycle, I'm sure they will, continue to grow some more. But it definitely pushes you because you're kind of always on the verge of discomfort because you don't know the right answers all the time.
Yeah, there's no playbook. Nobody wrote the playbook on how to launch Ixcela.
No,
sadly, you're in the process of writing it. And I think we'll take that and kind of segment into our next couple questions, or kind of centered around health and wellness. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on health and wellness in relation to Ixcela. What was it part of the vision initially to be this testing, or what would you call it? What was the grand vision that you had, call it 7 or 8 years ago, that led you to starting your company?
Well, so, we knew, so I had met my co-founder, chief scientist, back, even further, did my PhD work in a collaborative project with his lab and Kathy Costello she's the mass spec guru. So it was a collaborative project. And, when we sat back and started looking at the data that was essentially Wayne's life work, he's in his late 70s. He's been doing this for 50 years, right? Was the inventor of the pinprick blood test used to screen kids for lead, has done DNA analysis for NASA on astronauts in the International Space Station, has done metabolomics research for Duke, Mayo, Harvard, pick a research institution he has at some point likely worked with them, has been hired by pharma to do clinical trials work. I mean, he's been doing this for a long time. And we started to see these very interesting trends in some of the molecules that he was researching. They kept appearing over and over again as risk factors for certain types of diseases and conditions, disease progression markers. So, as you went through different phases of a condition, these markers would change, or they were just markers of overall health and wellness, right? So if you looked at 1,000 people who said they didn't sleep well and you looked at their biochemistry, some of these markers in their blood, you found that there were certain ones that were always lower or higher in those people who reported that they didn't, sleep as well, for example. And so, we were fascinated by this. And at the time, we were deciding, what's the path? What's the direction? Is this going to be a FDA? I mean, the big choice for biotech companies, first and foremost, is this an FDA drug approval path, or is this a more consumer-based, now we call it general health and wellness product? And, the FDA approval track is long. It does require, a lot of money to be raised. And at the time, we thought, well, we don't have a target. Is it right? You need a drug target. Are we designing a drug that's going to help with X, Y, or Z? And we didn't really know that. It didn't fit the model. Rather, the wellness route, which was, look, we have all this information. We have tens of thousands of data points showing that certain molecules are important for general health. They're important for sleep. They're important, as risk factors for heart issues and diabetes. And, okay, so we care about, and these molecules are things that you can control with diet, lifestyle, wellness interventions. So it's not like this is, it's not a miracle, it's just science. And you can, if you help people to measure these things, which typically aren't, measured in your traditional phlebotomy that happens when you go to see your doctor, we can measure them and we can provide recommendations, suggestions for ways to bring these molecules back into the right range to help people live better lives. And so, once you decide that, then you say, okay, now what are the guardrails within that I can play within? Because, we're not a diagnostic test, so we're not diagnosing Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's or anything like this. But we know that these molecules are super important to your, to your health. And so how do we present this in a consumer-friendly way? How do we make the test easy enough for someone to do at home? And so then then it's the science, right? So you design your test. So it's a pinprick blood test. You bleed a small volume of blood, you send it to us. All the testing had to be done for that because, in addition to the fact that there was a company called Theranos at the time that created a bit of a stir with all of their false claims about, pinprick blood tests. It took us a lot longer than, to get it all right, because it does actually require time and energy and testing to do properly. But the idea is you can do it. So you bleed, you send us the sample, we can look at that. We can tell you how much blood, the level of these markers are that are in your blood. And then we can give you recommendations for diet, lifestyle, wellness, mindfulness interventions that can be done to bring them back, into order. And, and now what we've done specifically is the test. And the test is important as a baseline, but offering consultation around it, because I think you can test people for things, but it's important to have a human talk to them about what are the results? What do they mean? What are you legitimately willing to change? What are you not legitimately willing to change? And then make a plan with that person and hold them accountable to it. And I think that, frankly, is really the most important part of the service, because, you can read something like in the report and be like, yeah, okay, that's cool, and then never do it. But I think that in meeting with someone and having the coach and having them say, okay, like, these are the things you need to do, you will get them to change their habits. Once they're used to doing that, then, I think you can step away. But it's fascinating, the human, we're all humans, and the minute we start feeling better too, we'd be like, oh yeah, I can do whatever I want again. But that was sort of the track. So it's, general health and wellness, trying to optimize health. And then now, we have a lot of data from different cohorts using the test for a variety of purposes, showing that it does help with sleep, or perimenopause and menopause symptoms, or thyroid related issues, or athletic recovery, etc.
That's so it's almost like the culmination of all of your life's work of being in the lab, measuring things, and then coupled with your feelings and thoughts on wanting to bring wellness to the community in some way, wanting to give back to the community in some way. And
Absolutely.
you had this expertise, you were surrounded by experts in the field, and you were able to make a vision and say, okay, we can maybe measure these things in the blood and give people recommendations on diet and lifestyle kind of changes that they can make. I'm actually really curious on how these, because I took the test, so I'm kind of up to my eyeballs in it. I'm doing some learning, I'm still doing a lot of reading, but something for me that shifted really dramatically during my transformation coming into kombucha and probiotics and the microbe world was this thought that changed in my head from my body actually being a fermentation machine versus it just being a machine that I fed stuff to. So I started thinking differently about how the foods I was eating are actually very similar to the environment that I brew kombucha in. I have microbes, they're in a warm environment. It's about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. I feed them a fuel source and they go through this fermentation process and they create, probiotics and vitamins and organic acids and other components. Are you measuring, essentially, are these metabolites the byproducts of my internal fermentation? Is that essentially what's going on? I'm eating things, they're going through this fermentation process, and you're able to measure those molecules in my blood.
Some of them are, for sure. So yes, right. So I say you eat a taco, and that taco has, right, let's say it's a meat taco of some kind. So you've got meat, you got some veggies, you have the corn shell, you chew it up, it goes into the stomach, it gets kind of broken down further, it goes into your small intestine. Small intestine is where the majority of interesting things happen. You have a lot of surface area in the small intestine. So if you were to look at it from the cross-sectional, like cut it down the middle, you'd see you have these finger-like projections that line the small intestine. The purpose of that is to increase the amount of surface area that you have in the small intestine. And those finger-like projections are cells that are shaped that way. They're coated with some, like a layer of mucus, which everyone knows what mucus is, like the sticky stuff that's in your nose. And your microbiome, so the actual bacteria, fungi, whatever, predominantly bacteria, they live in that matrix of mucus. As the food particles travel through, bacteria go to work eating it. We're feeding them, right? They're living with us. They're a symbiotic, organism that's living in there. And they say, ooh, yay. I really like meat. Like, I'm going to break that down. I'm hungry. I'm going to eat that. So they take that meat in, they break it down into building blocks, amino acids, let's say, and they spit them out. And they're absorbed through those finger-like cells. They all have these little capillary blood vessels in them. So those nutrients get absorbed, and then they meet up with your systemic circulation, and they go to the rest of your body, and they're used as building blocks to fuel your energy levels in the brain, to your hair and nails, to build your organs, your immune system, right? So the bacteria take in a lot of the nutrients that come in through the food. They process them, and I think it's a great analogy to say they ferment them to some extent. They digest them, ferment them, spit out other things. Those things are important that we need to stay healthy. Those things get absorbed through the intestinal lining, go into your circulation, and are used by the body for 1,000 other things. So it's really important to have healthy microbes in the gut, or else you're not absorbing any of these nutrients, properly. Or if your intestinal lining is damaged, again, you're not absorbing your nutrients properly, and you have other, potential aggravations and inflammations that can occur as a result of that. But I think it's a good analogy.
Thank you for that, because I feel like it gave me a good visual. I'm almost getting like a magic school bus kind of idea of traveling with the taco down into my intestines.
And then everything that's not digested, and just like the indigestible fiber and waste, goes into the large intestine, right? Water's pulled out, and that's what stool is. So, in general, the stool is kind of like, there's not much left in there of much value to us. It's, and we have our own feelings on
if everything's working correctly, right?
Yes. But I think, if you have other issues, if you have parasites and things, of course, you're going to see them, there. But it's quite fascinating. And what goes on in the small intestine, its functionality is really what is important here. It's less important. And frankly, we even say, to some extent, people are really fixated right now on, do you have 6 billion of these and 2 million of those and 18 million? It's not even really relevant, because the real question is, are the 6 million of those doing their job? If they're not doing their job, then you have a different problem anyway. So it's, is the bacteria in the gut able to do the job it needs to do for you to get the nutrients that you need in order to stay healthy?
That's perfect. Then on that note, do you have your top recommendations for athletes, or even just the general public, on what they can do to optimize that kind of small intestine work, or optimize the way their entire digestive system is working?
Yeah, the challenge with that is that we're all very different. So, we always encourage learning about it, right? Take a test, learn about what's going on in your gut microbiome. And of course, everyone's life situation is different, right? If you're a professional athlete, you are, you're doing a lot of cardio, you're doing a lot of weightlifting, you're really pushing the system. So the biochemistry is going to be very different from someone, who is more sedentary like me, doing Zoom calls every day. So I think first we always say, look, if you want to learn about this, take a test, learn about it, and then make adjustments, because you need to know what's going on with you. But in general, if you wanted just some tips, one, diversity of diet. It's actually really important to eat different types of foods. And we tend to be really bad at that. We tend to like the same things. We tend to eat the same foods. And why is this bad? Well, it's bad in that if you're constantly eating the same things, you're fueling the same bacteria. And over time, you can actually create, we call it a dysbiosis. So you can actually skew the ratios of bacteria in your gut, because you're giving preferential treatment to the ones that you're constantly feeding. So, if you eat a lot of, let's say, pizzas, hot dogs, it's just an example, but pizzas, hot dogs, corn dogs, I don't know, donuts, you're giving preferential advantage to the bacteria that are breaking down a lot of breads, processed things, and these tend to be the more invasive bacteria that you don't want. And they outcompete, right? They're all competing for survival in your gut. And if you don't feed the other ones die off. And now you have this dysbiosis where you have only one type of bacteria in there, and diversity is a good thing. You want as much diversity as possible. So in your diet, make sure to include different types of foods, fruits, vegetables, different types of vegetables, protein sources. Keep it keep it fresh and keep choice, because even frankly, even certain bacteria, one will like celery, one will like Brussels sprouts, and again, it really depends on how you're fueling them. But so diversity of diet, I think, is super important as a general, as a general, tip. Getting enough sleep is really important. Not just, people say, well, why did they say that? Why is it important? It has a lot to do with circadian rhythms, your circadian rhythms. And I could spend a lot of time on this, but they're all tied together, and it affects the health of the microbiome. Stress. We talk about stress. People say, oh, we don't want you to be stressed out. Why is that? Well, when the body is stressed out, it's in a perpetual state of sort of fight or flight. And fight or flight means that you're not, because you're too busy trying to run away from the dinosaur, right, that is coming after you, that you don't have the time to rest and digest. And the body needs time to properly digest and absorb the food that you're consuming. So if you're constantly stressed, that doesn't happen correctly. Your peristalsis of your intestines doesn't happen correctly. You might be suffering from constant diarrhea because you're not able to properly relax and have those nutrients absorbed. So you're, to your point, you're just flushing the system rather than having time to rest. Cortisol is being pumped at a really high level, which actually increases the inflammatory, process. So again, every so often it's good, right, to have that. I mean, should you be chased by a Tyrannosaurus Rex, it's important to have the fight or flight working properly. But if you're constantly in a state of fight or flight, your body can't sustain that, and you're damaging your microbiome. You're not getting the nutrients that you need. Cortisol levels are elevating your physiological immune response, your immunity, and so it's bad. So these are like basic tips that I think sometimes they're still, this is not rocket science. They're still completely accurate. Knowing why they're being issued is important. I think a lot of people don't. So they say, yeah, everybody tells me, like, don't be stressed out. This is why you don't want to be stressed out. And again, at Ixcela, we're trying to make these things a little bit more straightforward so people understand why. They're much more likely to change habits if they understand why they're hurting themselves in doing what they're doing.
Totally. Yeah. Those are great tips and things that I think, to your point, it's like a lot of these things are intuitive. We have an understanding. It's learning how to create behavior change and learning how to change our patterns that ends up being the most difficult part. And I think, in my journey with Ixcela, I feel like the test helped me bridge the logical and emotional side of my brain, where I had an emotional understanding of a lot of these things, but seeing it in a test, seeing it measured, helped me make those changes. And another book I read called The Talent Code. Are you familiar with that one at all?
No.
He looked at how patterns are created in the brain, and how when we say you're an athlete and you're learning a new skill, I'm learning how to kick a soccer ball at a goal. The first few times I do that, I'm going to suck. There is no pattern yet. And there's actually a physical wrapping around of myelin on that structure that starts to grow stronger and stronger and stronger as I practice it more and more and more. And so again, this helped me bridge that gap of, it's okay that I suck, or it's okay that this new pattern there's resistance. It's not easy because I haven't practiced it, and that there's actually a physical thing that's building in my brain. And what myelin does is it actually increases the conductivity of that pattern. So when you start out, the analogy I use is the internet. You're on dial-up. I mean, it's slow, it's clunky. You pick up the phone, you hear that weird noise, or whatever it was from way back in the day. But as you're building that myelin sheath, it's like you're wrapping an insulation around a wire. and that signal can travel faster and travel more frequently. And I think bridging that gap for people is difficult because there's a lot of resistance and new patterns. But if you can learn this understanding that you're building physical infrastructure in your brain for those new patterns, that helped me a lot learn that it's okay to not be good at something first try. As athletes, we know that. As scientists, you learn that as well. You start with a theory, you have to test it, and you have to test it in a lot of different ways, and you have to try and actually disprove your theory as well in several different methods to test it. And that's something that I found super powerful that I think you guys are doing a great job at, which is you have the test, but you also have this accountability human element to it that's kind of hand holding that person while they're building that new infrastructure in their brain to make these diet and lifestyle changes. So with that, Erika, I think this is a great place to stop for our first episode. I'd love to have you on in future seasons. As I start to learn more, I'll have more questions to ask. I'm sure some of our fans and audience are going to have some questions for you too after we get the episode live here in a month or so. One of the last questions I like to end with is, what's next for Erika and Ixcela? I mean, do you separate, I'm sure you have some personal goals, I'm sure you have some goals for the company, but what can we look for in your journey, and how can we follow along? Do we find you on social media, or what are some of those mediums that we can look for you on?
It's a great question. I mean, I think for Ixcela, large picture, again, our mission is to reach as many people as possible. And, at this point, there are so many different types of partnerships that we are in for, and again, it's the neat part about the test is that it really has a variety of different functions depending on what you're trying to do. When we say to help people be better, is it through athletic performance and recovery? Is it through, mental performance and being better at focusing and sleeping and, our mental athletes and just improving their performance? Or if you're a student of your health and whether you're pre-pregnancy, pregnancy, or battling GI related issues, or maybe you're just been struggling with, yo-yoing weight for a long time, can't figure out what's going on. I think what's neat about what we do is it can actually help lots of different people with many different types of problems. And so, I think we're learning, where is our sweet spot? And the goal is to reach as many people as possible. So I think for Ixcela, it's continuing to, find our niche, find the audiences that most benefit, from the product, gathering those stories and testimonials and really doing our best to help improve people's lives. For me personally, I get asked all the time, what are you going to do when you grow up? I don't know the answer to that question. I'm trying to enjoy this journey where, I learn new things every day, new challenges every day, trying to, and it's tricky, right? I mean, there are other testing services that purport to be able to do lots of things that candidly they can't. And it's always a challenge to try to stay above the noise. And, how do you keep the quality? How do you, keep that dedication to making sure the product is always outstanding and that the offering is outstanding, and we're always trying to be better. And it always really irks me when I see these things or people promising stuff that's just nonsense. And trying to make sure that, that we stay, above that. But again, personally, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's just continuing to grow, as a leader, learning as much as I can about the field, the space, making the space in my life to be able to grow and become better, by whatever it takes. And to persist long enough to succeed. I mean, I think one of the things about startups that people don't understand is that, you think it's going to take 3 years and it takes 10. And one of my investors, early investors who passed away, sadly, one of the most wonderful people I've ever known. He always said, Erika, like, if you think you're going to be right, in your initial business model, and all entrepreneurs think they're going to be right? Like, this is the plan. He said, you're either going to be lucky or wrong. Most likely wrong. And he was right. We've changed things up a little bit as we've gone along. And it takes, 3 times as long and costs 10 times as much. And I think that's why a lot of entrepreneurs fail, because they don't raise enough money and they don't stay in it long enough to figure out how to do it. So for me, it's just staying patient, stay on target. It's that line from Star Wars, right? Stay on target, stay on target, stay on target, and persist.
That's beautiful. Well, Erika, thank you for joining us today. I appreciate you laying the groundwork of your younger self and some of the lessons that you learned on the way. I'm confident, based on the humble response that you just gave us, that you are going to be a huge success. You already are, in fact, in my mind, and your test has helped me. I plan on actually making it available for our staff. We're going to be going through kind of an internal company. We're going to set some goals for ourselves and make some plans to get healthier and be here for the long run. So I'll be putting some stuff in the show notes if people want to get access to the test, and I'll show them where they can get it, what it looks like. And we'll see you on season 2 here coming up probably sometime next year, Erika.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks so much.
Yes, of course. We'll talk to you soon.
All righty.
And that wraps up another fantastic episode on the Matt Lancor Podcast. A big thanks to our incredible guest today, Dr. Erika Ebbel Angle, the CEO of Ixcela, the internal fitness company. Whether you're a mom, an active human, or an elite athlete, I hope you found something inspiring in today's conversation. It's not every day that you get insights from a biochemistry guru who's also a former Miss Massachusetts, scuba diver, skier, and classical piano pro. Don't forget to check out Erika's TEDx talks. On gut health, there's a wealth of knowledge waiting for you. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, this podcast isn't just about science. It's about life, passion, and making a difference. Stay connected, stay curious, and until next time, this is Matt Lancor, signing off.